The detective swore loyalty to the law until his father's name appeared in the files. The December wind cut through Chicago's streets like a razor, carrying with it the scent of coal smoke and something darker, the metallic tang of violence that had become as familiar as morning coffee. Detective Thomas McKenna pulled his wool coat tighter as he stepped from the streetcar, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The year 1926 was drawing to a close, and with it, another chapter in the city's endless war between law and lawlessness. Thomas had been with the Chicago Police Department for 8 years, earning his detective badge through a combination of relentless dedication and an almost religious devotion to justice. At 32, he was younger than most in his position, but his reputation preceded him through the precinct halls like whispered prayers. He was the cop who couldn't be bought, the one who turned down envelopes thick with cash, the detective who actually solved cases instead of filing them away in dusty cabinets. The streets of Chicago's South Side told their own story that morning. Broken glass glittered like diamonds on the sidewalks, and the wooden boards covering shattered storefronts bore the scars of the previous night's violence. The Torrio Capone organization had been tightening its grip on the city, and every morning brought fresh evidence of their expanding territory. Thomas had seen it all before: the intimidation, the protection rackets, the bodies that turned up in the Chicago River with concrete shoes. His destination was a narrow brick building that housed Murphy's Pub, a modest establishment that served the working-class Irish families who still called this neighborhood home. The owner, Sean Murphy, had been found dead behind the bar at dawn, a single bullet wound to the back of his head. It was execution style, professional, and it bore all the hallmarks of organized crime enforcement. As Thomas pushed through the pub's heavy wooden door, the familiar smell of stale beer and tobacco wrapped around him like an old coat. The crime scene had been cordoned off, but the chalk outline on the floor behind the mahogany bar told its own grim story. Detective Ray Sullivan, his partner of 4 years, looked up from his notebook with the expression of a man who had seen too much. "Another one, Tommy," Sullivan said, his Irish accent still thick despite 20 years in Chicago. "Clean shot, close range. Murphy's wife says he'd been getting visits from some well-dressed gentleman lately, asking about his contributions to neighborhood security." Thomas knelt beside the chalk outline, studying the scene with the methodical precision that had made him one of the department's most effective investigators. The blood spatter pattern, the position of the body, the lack of defensive wounds, it all pointed to someone Murphy had trusted, or at least someone he hadn't seen as a threat until it was too late. "Any witnesses?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. In neighborhoods like this, blindness and deafness were survival skills. "The usual," Sullivan replied with a bitter laugh. "Nobody saw nothing, nobody heard nothing. But Murphy's daughter, Katie, she mentioned something interesting. Said her father had been talking about the old days lately, about some detective who used to come around when she was little, someone her father trusted." Thomas felt a cold sensation that had nothing to do with the December weather. "Did she remember a name?" "McKenna," Sullivan said, watching his partner's face carefully. "Said it was Detective McKenna." "That means something to you, Tommy?" The pub seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Thomas McKenna had spent his entire adult life building a reputation built on integrity and dedication to the law. But Detective McKenna wasn't an uncommon name in Chicago, and the force had seen many Irish cops over the decades. Still, the coincidence felt like a weight settling on his chest. "My father was a cop," Thomas said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "Patrick McKenna. He worked this beat back in the early 1900s, before I was born." Sullivan nodded slowly, pieces of an invisible puzzle beginning to take shape. "Katie Murphy's about 30 now. If her father was talking about a Detective McKenna from when she was little, we're talking about the early 1900s. That timeline fits." "Tommy." Thomas stood, brushing dust from his knees, and looked around the pub with new eyes. The establishment had clearly been here for decades, its walls yellowed with age and its fixtures bearing the patina of countless conversations and countless secrets. His father had walked these same floors, had perhaps sat at this very bar, had known Sean Murphy when the man was younger and the world was different. "I need to see Murphy's daughter," Thomas said, though something in his stomach was already rebelling against the decision. and I need to check the old case files, see what my father was working on back then." Sullivan placed a hand on his partner's shoulder, a gesture of support that spoke volumes in their unspoken brotherhood. "You sure about this, Tommy? Sometimes the past is better left buried. Your father's been dead 8 years now. What good can come from digging up old stories?" Thomas looked once more at the chalk outline on the floor, at the dark stain that marked where Sean Murphy had died, and felt the weight of his badge against his chest. He had sworn an oath to uphold the law, to seek truth and deliver justice, regardless of where that truth might lead. But he had never imagined that oath might one day require him to investigate his own father's legacy. "I became a cop to honor his memory," Thomas said quietly. "If there's something here that needs to be uncovered, then I owe it to him and to Murphy to find out what it is." The December wind rattled the pub's windows as if responding to his words, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. Chicago continued its relentless march forward, but for Thomas McKenna, time seemed to be moving backward, towards secrets that had been buried with his father and were now clawing their way back to the surface, one dead body at a time. The basement of the Chicago Police Department's Central District was a labyrinth of filing cabinets, dust-covered boxes, and the accumulated weight of decades' worth of investigations. Thomas had descended into this bureaucratic underworld with the kind of reluctance usually reserved for visiting graveyards. The overhead bulbs cast harsh shadows between the towering shelves, creating pools of light and darkness that seemed to mirror his own conflicted feelings about what he might discover. Detective Ray Sullivan had offered to accompany him, but Thomas had declined. Some journeys, he reasoned, were meant to be taken alone. The records clerk, a wizened man named Fitzgerald, who seemed to have been part of the building's foundation since its construction, had directed him toward the section containing files from 1900 to 1910, with a knowing nod that suggested he had seen many officers come searching for their fathers. Ghosts. The McKenna files were surprisingly thin for a detective who had served 15 years on the force. Thomas spread the folders across a dusty table and began reading by the light of a single bulb, his father's career unfolding before him like pages from a book he had never been allowed to read. Patrick McKenna had been assigned to the same South Side district where Thomas now worked, walking beats that included the very neighborhood where Sean Murphy had died. The early reports painted a picture of a dedicated officer dealing with the usual urban challenges of the era: pickpockets, domestic disputes, public drunkenness, and the occasional burglary. But as Thomas read deeper, a different pattern began to emerge. His father's name appeared with increasing frequency in cases involving what the reports euphemistically called organized criminal enterprises, the early incarnations of what would later become the powerful syndicates that now controlled much of Chicago. One report, dated March 1905, caught his attention with its unusual detail and careful language. Patrick McKenna had been investigating a series of warehouse fires in the industrial district, blazes that had conveniently destroyed evidence in several pending criminal cases. The report noted that Detective McKenna had identified a pattern connecting the fires to a network of corrupt officials, but the investigation had been terminated due to lack of evidence, just weeks before a major trial was scheduled to begin. Thomas felt his hands trembling slightly as he turned the pages. The careful, methodical handwriting was unmistakably his father's. He recognized it from the few personal letters that had survived Patrick's death. But the content of these reports was raising questions that Thomas wasn't sure he wanted answered. A folder marked Confidential Internal Affairs contained documents that made his blood run cold. His father had been under investigation by the department's internal watchdog unit for conduct incompatible with departmental standards. The charges were vague but serious: failure to follow proper procedures, unauthorized contact with known criminals, and discrepancies in evidence handling. The investigative file painted a picture that contradicted everything Thomas had believed about his father. According to witness statements, Patrick McKenna had been seen entering establishments known to be fronts for illegal gambling operations. He had been observed in conversation with men whose names appeared on the department's most wanted lists. Most damaging of all, there were allegations that he had accepted payments in exchange for information about pending raids and ongoing investigations. Thomas leaned back in his chair, feeling as if the basement walls were closing in around him. The Patrick McKenna described in these files was not the hero cop his son had grown up idolizing, but rather a corrupt officer who had sold his badge to the highest bidder. Yet even as the evidence mounted, something about the reports felt wrong, as if important pieces of the story were missing. He found those missing pieces in a folder that had been misfiled among traffic violation reports from 1907. The documents inside bore the letterhead of the Chicago Tribune and contained correspondence between his father and a crime reporter named Marcus Webb. The letters revealed a complex web of corruption that extended far beyond a single detective's misconduct. According to Webb's notes, Patrick McKenna had not been taking bribes. He had been gathering evidence. Working undercover with the reporter's assistance, Detective McKenna had been documenting a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Chicago's political and law enforcement establishment. The warehouse fires, the terminated investigations, the mysterious meetings with criminals, all of it had been part of an elaborate operation to expose corruption that went straight to the mayor's office. The final letter in the collection was dated just 2 weeks before Patrick McKenna's death in 1908. In it, Webb warned the detective that their investigation had been discovered and that his life might be in danger. "They know about the evidence we've collected," Webb wrote. "The photographs, the financial records, the testimony from witnesses, all of it is compromised. You need to disappear, Patrick, before they decide that silencing you is their only option." Thomas's hands were shaking openly now as he read his father's response, written in the careful script he remembered from childhood birthday cards. "I became a police officer to serve justice, not to run from it. If they want to stop this investigation, they'll have to go through me. I've hidden copies of everything in a place they'll never think to look. If something happens to me, make sure my son knows that his father died trying to do what was right." The letter was the last document in the file, and Thomas realized with growing horror that his father had indeed died just days after writing it. The official cause of death had been listed as a heart attack, but now Thomas wondered if Patrick McKenna's heart had been stopped by natural causes or by more sinister means. As he sat in the basement surrounded by the accumulated secrets of decades, Thomas felt the weight of his father's legacy settling on his shoulders like a mantle he had never asked to wear. The hero cop he had idolized was real, but so was the danger that had ultimately claimed his life. And somewhere in Chicago, hidden in a place that corrupt officials had never found, was evidence that could still bring down the very people who had silenced his father. The overhead bulb flickered once, twice, then steadied, casting its harsh light across the scattered documents. Thomas began gathering the files with new purpose, understanding that Sean Murphy's death was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern that stretched back through the decades. His father had died trying to expose the truth, and now that truth was calling to his son across the years, demanding to be heard. Above his head, the sounds of the working police station continued, telephones ringing, voices calling, typewriters clacking. But Thomas McKenna was no longer thinking about the present. He was thinking about justice delayed, about promises made to the dead, and about the possibility that a son's badge might finally finish the work that a father's bullet-stopped heart had been forced to leave undone. Katie Murphy lived in a narrow apartment above her late father's pub, reached by a steep staircase that groaned under Thomas's weight as he climbed toward answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The December wind howled through the gaps in the building's old wooden frame, carrying with it the sounds of a city that never quite slept, distant sirens, the clatter of streetcars, and the muted conversations of people who conducted their most important business after dark. She opened the door before he could knock, as if she had been watching for him through the lace curtains. Katie Murphy was a woman marked by both beauty and sorrow, her dark hair pulled back in a practical style, and her green eyes holding the kind of wariness that came from growing up in a neighborhood where trust was a luxury few could afford. She wore a simple black dress that spoke of recent mourning and practical necessity in equal measure. "To Detective McKenna," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I've been expecting you since Ray Sullivan mentioned your name yesterday. Please, come in. The coffee's hot, and I imagine you'll need it for what we have to discuss." The apartment was small but clean, furnished with the kind of sturdy pieces that were built to last through generations of hard living. Photographs covered every available surface, images of the Murphy family through the decades, including several that showed a younger Sean Murphy standing beside men in police uniforms. Thomas found himself studying these pictures with new intensity, searching for his father's face among the group shots and formal poses. "Your father and mine were friends," Katie said, following his gaze to a particular photograph that showed Sean Murphy raising a glass alongside a tall man with familiar features. "That's Detective Patrick McKenna, taken right here in this apartment sometime around 1906. They used to meet here regularly, always late at night, always speaking in whispers." Thomas accepted the cup of coffee she offered, noting how his hands remained steady despite the storm of emotions building in his chest. "What did they talk about?" Katie settled into a chair across from him, her movements graceful despite the weight of grief she carried. "My father never told me directly, but children hear things. They spoke about corruption, about money changing hands in places where it shouldn't, about good men being forced to make impossible choices, and they talked about evidence, photographs, documents, things that could bring down important people if they ever saw the light of day." The coffee was strong and bitter, much like the truth Thomas was beginning to piece together. "In the files I found yesterday, there was mention of evidence that my father had hidden. Do you know anything about that?" "I know more than I should," Katie admitted, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "After your father died, Detective McKenna came here one last time. He was different that night, frightened in a way I had never seen him before. He gave my father a small wooden box and made him promise to keep it safe until someone came looking for it with the right questions." Thomas set down his coffee cup with careful precision, afraid that his trembling hands might betray the intensity of his emotions. "That was 18 years ago. Why didn't your father turn the box over to the authorities?" "Because," Katie said with a bitter laugh, "the authorities were the ones your father and mine were investigating. That box contains evidence of corruption that reaches into the highest levels of the police department and city government. My father knew that the wrong people getting their hands on it would mean death sentences for anyone connected to the investigation." She rose from her chair and moved to an old armoire that dominated one corner of the room. From behind a false back panel, she withdrew a wooden box about the size of a cigar case, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. The sight of it made Thomas's heart race, as if he were looking at something that had been calling to him across the decades. "Your father made my father promise that this would only be given to someone who asked the right questions and could be trusted to use the evidence properly," Katie continued, holding the box but not yet offering it to him. "The question I have to ask you, Detective McKenna, is whether you're ready to see what your father died trying to expose, knowing that it might destroy everything you thought you knew about him and about the department you've sworn to serve." Thomas stood and moved to the window, looking down at the street where his father had once walked his beat and where Sean Murphy had lived his final years guarding secrets that had ultimately cost him his life. The neighborhood looked different in the daylight, more tired and worn than it had seemed during his previous visit, as if the weight of its hidden history was visible in every cracked sidewalk and boarded window. "My father raised me to believe in justice," he said finally, turning back to face Katie. "If he died trying to expose corruption, then I owe it to his memory to finish what he started, regardless of where that path might lead." Katie nodded and extended the box toward him. "Then you're more like him than I think you realize. But I have to warn you, opening this box will change your life. Once you see what's inside, you can never go back to being the detective who simply solved cases and went home at night. You'll become part of something much larger and much more dangerous." Thomas took the box, surprised by its weight. It felt solid and substantial, as if it contained more than mere documents and photographs. The wood was dark with age, and he could see scratches on its surface that suggested it had been handled frequently over the years. A small brass latch held it closed, and Thomas realized that his hands were trembling as he reached for it. "Before you open it," Katie said, her voice urgent, "you need to understand what killed my father. 3 days ago, someone came asking about this box. They knew about your father's investigation, they knew about the evidence, and they knew that my father had been its guardian all these years. When he refused to tell them where it was hidden, they put a bullet in his head." The implications of her words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Sean Murphy had died protecting evidence that could still bring down corrupt officials, evidence that someone was willing to kill to suppress, and now that same evidence was in his hands, making him both the heir to his father's mission and a target for the same forces that had silenced both Patrick McKenna and Sean Murphy. "Who came asking about the box?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Men in expensive suits who spoke with authority," Katie replied. "Men who knew too much about police procedures and department protocols to be ordinary criminals. My father said they reminded him of the corrupt officials your father had been investigating, only older and more dangerous." Thomas stared at the box in his hands, understanding that he was holding more than evidence. He was holding the power to either vindicate his father's memory or destroy his own career. The safe choice would be to leave the box unopened, to file Sean Murphy's death as another unsolved homicide, and to continue his career as a detective who followed orders and didn't ask inconvenient questions. But as he thought about the chalk outline on the pub floor and the carefully written reports in his father's handwriting, Thomas realized that the safe choice was no longer available to him. The moment he had found those files in the basement, he had stepped onto a path that led inevitably to this moment, to this choice, to this reckoning with a legacy he had inherited without understanding its true cost. The December wind rattled the apartment windows as Thomas lifted the brass latch and slowly opened the box that had waited 18 years for his father's son to claim it. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay the evidence that would either deliver justice or destroy everything he had ever believed about honor, duty, and the thin blue line that separated order from chaos in the unforgiving streets of Chicago. The contents of the wooden box spread across Katie Murphy's kitchen table, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that revealed a picture far more disturbing than Thomas had ever imagined. Photographs, financial records, witness statements, and official correspondence painted a portrait of systematic corruption that reached from the lowest beat cop to the mayor's office and beyond. His father's careful documentation told the story of a city where justice was bought and sold like any other commodity. The photographs were the most damaging evidence. Shot with a hidden camera, they showed prominent Chicago officials accepting envelopes filled with cash from known criminals. Thomas recognized several faces from the current city government, men who had been young assistants and junior officials in his father's day, and had since risen to positions of considerable power. Among them was Deputy Police Commissioner Frank Torino, whose signature appeared on many of the documents that had ended his father's investigation prematurely. "Jesus Christ," Thomas whispered, holding up a photograph that showed Torino looking 20 years younger, shaking hands with Johnny Torrio himself in what appeared to be a private office. "This man has been my superior for 3 years. I've reported directly to him on dozens of cases." Katie leaned over his shoulder to examine the photograph. "Your father spent months documenting their meetings." According to his notes, Torino was receiving regular payments in exchange for information about upcoming raids and investigations. Every time the department got close to making serious arrests, someone would tip off the criminals and they would disappear like smoke. The financial records were equally revealing. Patrick McKenna had somehow obtained copies of bank statements showing regular deposits into accounts controlled by police officials, amounts that far exceeded their official salaries. The money trail connected dirty cops to protection rackets, illegal gambling operations, and the early bootlegging enterprises that would later make men like Al Capone wealthy beyond imagination. But it was the witness statements that struck Thomas most deeply. His father had convinced several people to come forward with testimony about corruption they had witnessed, promising them protection that he had ultimately been unable to provide. Thomas recognized some of the names from unsolved murder cases, witnesses who had died under suspicious circumstances in the months following his father's death. "They killed them all," Thomas said, his voice hollow with the realization of how many people had died to protect the secrets contained in this box. "Everyone who cooperated with my father's investigation ended up dead within a year of his death." "Not everyone," Katie corrected, producing a letter from the bottom of the box. "There was one witness who survived, someone your father trusted completely, someone who might still be alive and willing to testify if the right person approached him." The letter was addressed to Detective McKenna's son and bore the signature of Marcus Webb, the Tribune crime reporter who had worked with Patrick on the investigation. Webb's message was brief but clear. He had survived the purge that followed Patrick's death by disappearing into Chicago's underground, but he had continued to gather evidence against the corrupt network. If Patrick's son ever came looking for the truth, Webb could be found through a bartender named Jimmy at O'Malley's Tavern on the city's west side. Thomas felt a cold certainty settling in his chest as he studied the evidence spread before him. Sean Murphy had been killed because someone had discovered that he possessed this box, which meant that the corrupt officials his father had investigated were still active and still willing to commit murder to protect their secrets. The investigation that had died with Patrick McKenna in 1908 was suddenly very much alive again, and Thomas found himself cast in the role of both detective and target. "There's something else," Katie said, reaching into the box one final time. "Goody, something your father left specifically for you." She handed him an envelope marked, "For my son, if he chooses to follow in my footsteps." Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Patrick McKenna's careful handwriting, a letter that had waited 18 years to be read. "Thomas May, if you are reading this, then I am dead, and the investigation I began has fallen to you to complete. I know the evidence in this box paints a dark picture of the department and the city we both swore to serve, but I want you to understand that corruption is like a cancer. It spreads if good men do nothing to stop it. The men I was investigating killed me not because I was a threat to them, but because the truth I had uncovered was a threat to the entire system they had built. They turned Chicago into their personal kingdom, and they will kill anyone who challenges their rule. If you choose to continue this work, know that you will be walking the same dangerous path that cost me my life, but also know that you will not be walking it alone. There are still good men in the department and in the city government who are waiting for someone brave enough to stand up to the corruption. The evidence in this box can bring down the men who have turned our city into a marketplace for criminals, but only if it reaches the right hands at the right time. I raised you to believe in justice, Kama's son, and I pray that belief will give you the strength to do what I could not. Survive long enough to see these men brought to trial. Trust no one in the department above the rank of sergeant, and remember that the most dangerous enemies are often the ones who wear badges just like yours. Your loving father, Patrick McKenna." Thomas read the letter twice before the full implications settled in his mind. His father had not only documented the corruption, he had identified himself as a target and predicted his own death. And now, 18 years later, history was repeating itself with Thomas cast in his father's role as the detective who possessed dangerous knowledge. A knock at the apartment door interrupted his thoughts, causing both Thomas and Katie to freeze in place. The sound was soft but persistent, and something about its rhythm suggested authority rather than casual visitation. Katie moved to the window and peered through the curtains before turning back to Thomas with fear written clearly across her face. "Two men in police uniforms," she whispered. "They're not from the local precinct. I know all those boys by sight. These men look like they mean business." Thomas quickly gathered the photographs and documents, returning them to the wooden box with practiced efficiency. His mind was racing through possibilities and escape routes, but the apartment's location above the pub meant there was only one way down, through the front door that was currently being watched by unknown officers. The knocking became more insistent, and a voice called out with the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. "Chicago Police Department, we need to speak with Miss Murphy about her father's death." "They know about the box," Katie whispered, her face pale with terror. "Someone told them it was here, and they've come to collect it." Thomas checked his service revolver and found himself facing the same impossible choice that had confronted his father 18 years earlier. He could surrender the evidence and likely face the same fate that had befallen Patrick McKenna and Sean Murphy, or he could fight to protect the truth regardless of the consequences. The apartment suddenly felt very small, and Thomas realized that his decision in the next few moments would determine not only his own fate, but also the fate of every piece of evidence his father had died trying to preserve. Outside, the December wind continued to howl through Chicago's streets, carrying with it the promise that some storms, once begun, could only end in blood. The back stairs of Murphy's pub creaked under their weight as Thomas and Katie descended into the building's basement, the wooden box clutched tightly in Thomas's arms. Above them, the sound of splintering wood indicated that the officers had grown tired of waiting for permission to enter. They had perhaps minutes before the search reached the lower levels of the building. The pub's basement was a maze of beer kegs, storage boxes, and mechanical equipment that had accumulated over decades of operation. Katie led him through the labyrinth with the confidence of someone who had played in these shadows as a child. past broken furniture and forgotten inventory, toward a section of the stone foundation that looked different from the rest. "My father had this installed after your father gave him the box," she explained, running her fingers along what appeared to be solid stone until she found a hidden mechanism. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow tunnel that led into the city's underground. "It connects to the old brewery tunnels that run under this whole district. Prohibition made them valuable real estate for people who needed to move things without being seen." Thomas had heard rumors of Chicago's underground network, tunnels and passages that had been carved out during the city's early industrial period, and later expanded by bootleggers and other criminal enterprises. But he had never imagined that he would need to use them to escape from his own colleagues. They crawled through the narrow passage for what felt like miles, their progress lit by a small electric torch that Katie had grabbed from the pub's emergency supplies. The tunnel was cold and damp, filled with the sound of dripping water and their own labored breathing. Thomas found himself thinking about his father's investigation and wondering if Patrick had ever found himself in similar circumstances, fleeing through Chicago's underground to protect evidence that could reshape the city's power structure. The tunnel eventually opened into a larger chamber that connected to several other passages. Katie consulted a hand-drawn map that looked like it had been passed down through generations of people who needed to move unseen through the city. After several more minutes of navigation, they emerged through a hidden entrance in the basement of O'Malley's Tavern, the establishment mentioned in Marcus Webb's letter. O'Malley's was the kind of working-class bar that served as a second home for men who built the city with their hands and washed away their sorrows with whiskey. The basement smelled of beer and tobacco, and the sound of conversation and laughter filtered down from the main floor. A bartender named Jimmy, who looked like he had been serving drinks since the Civil War, greeted them without surprise, as if people regularly emerged from his basement carrying mysterious wooden boxes. "You'd be Detective McKenna's boy," Jimmy said, studying Thomas's face with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. "You look just like him. Webb's been waiting upstairs for 18 years, wondering if you'd ever come looking for answers." Marcus Webb had aged into a thin, nervous man whose hands shook slightly as he examined the contents of Patrick McKenna's wooden box. He was dressed in the rumpled clothes of a journalist who had been living on the margins of society for too long, but his eyes were sharp and focused as he studied the evidence that had cost so many people their lives. "I've been adding to this collection for nearly 2 decades, Webb explained, producing his own folder of documents and photographs. "The corruption your father documented has only grown worse over the years. The men he was investigating have consolidated their power and expanded their operations. They now control not just the police department but also the courts, the mayor's office, and half the businesses in the city." Webb's additional evidence painted a picture of Chicago as a city completely under the control of organized crime and corrupt officials. The same network that Patrick McKenna had died trying to expose now operated with virtual impunity, protected by badges and judicial robes that had been purchased with blood money. "But there's been a development that changes everything," Webb continued, his voice dropping to a whisper despite the noise from the tavern above. "The federal government has been building its own case against Chicago's corrupt machine. They're looking for witnesses and evidence, and they have the power to prosecute cases that local authorities would never pursue." Thomas felt a spark of hope for the first time since opening his father's box. "You're talking about federal prosecutors, people who can't be bought by the local crime syndicates." "Exactly," Webb confirmed. "There's a federal task force being organized specifically to investigate corruption in Chicago's government. They're led by a prosecutor named Elliot Ness, and they're looking for evidence exactly like what your father collected. If we can get this information to them, it could finally bring down the network that has controlled this city for decades." The plan that emerged from their conversation was both simple and dangerous. Webb would use his remaining contacts in the journalism world to arrange a meeting with the federal task force, while Thomas would return to his regular duties as a detective, gathering additional evidence while pretending that nothing had changed. It was a delicate balancing act that required Thomas to continue working with the same corrupt officials his father had died trying to expose. Over the following weeks, Thomas found himself living 2 lives simultaneously. During the day, he investigated routine crimes and reported to Deputy Commissioner Torino, the same man whose photograph showed him accepting bribes from Johnny Torrio. At night, he met with Webb and Katie to plan their approach to the federal authorities and to document new evidence of ongoing corruption. The breakthrough came when Thomas discovered that Sean Murphy's murder had been ordered by Torino himself, who had learned about the hidden evidence through an informant in the police department. The same network that had silenced Patrick McKenna 18 years earlier was still active, still killing to protect its secrets, and still confident that local law enforcement would never challenge their authority. On a cold February morning in 1927, Thomas McKenna walked into a federal courthouse carrying his father's wooden box and 18 years' worth of accumulated evidence. The federal prosecutors who received the materials were amazed by their scope and detail, describing them as the most comprehensive documentation of municipal corruption they had ever seen. The trials that followed made headlines across the nation as one after another of Chicago's most powerful officials were convicted of corruption charges. Deputy Commissioner Torino was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, along with dozens of other police officials, judges, and city administrators. The crime syndicate that had controlled Chicago for decades found itself facing federal prosecution for the first time, and many of its leaders fled the city rather than face trial. Thomas McKenna was promoted to chief of detectives, tasked with rebuilding a police department that had been gutted by the corruption scandal. On his first day in his new office, he hung a photograph of his father on the wall, not the formal police portrait that had decorated their family home, but one of the surveillance photographs from Patrick's investigation, showing him meeting with Marcus Webb to discuss evidence that would eventually bring justice to a city that had been held hostage by corruption for too long. The badge that Thomas wore still carried the weight of his oath to uphold the law, but now it also carried the memory of his father's sacrifice and the knowledge that sometimes justice required more courage than any single person should have to possess. Chicago's streets were still dangerous, still filled with crime and violence, but for the first time in decades, the men charged with protecting those streets were actually serving justice rather than selling it to the highest bidder. In the end, Thomas realized his father's greatest victory had not been the evidence he collected or the criminals he exposed, but the faith he had maintained that truth would eventually triumph over corruption, and that a son's love for justice could finish the work that a father's bullet-stopped heart had been forced to leave undone.